I can say that our people, without being stupidly optimistic, are full of confidence and are absolutely resolved.
Let us then move forward together in discharge of our mission and our duty, fearing God and nothing else.
Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful historical morsels of British political history.
This week, we're talking about confidence votes in the Conservative Party, something which three leaders, Iain Duncan Smith, Theresa May and Boris Johnson, have been subjected to with dramatic consequences. But first, we discuss our matters of interest, something which has caught our eye over the past week. Richard, why don't you kick us off?
Well, my matter of interest this week is a post on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, by a PhD researcher at Manchester University named James Breckholt. James has studied Lib Dem voters in the 2024 general election, and I think his work does a great job at dispelling some of our assumptions about that electorate. For one, many people have in mind that the typical Lib Dem voter is an upper middle class suburbanite who loves the EU, guava and Gales. And it's true that Lib Dem constituencies and many Lib Dem voters are among the poshest in the country. But that is only part of the story, because James is particularly interested in the people who voted Conservative in 2019 and then switched to the Lib Dems in 2024. That was about 1 in 6 of the Lib Dem voters at the last election. And I think many people assume that these people left the Tory party because they couldn't stomach a kind of right-wing, hardline, anti-EU set of politics, and the Lib Dems were much more moderate on a variety of different policy issues. But the reality is not quite that. This group of voters, as James shows, is poorer and more right-wing than other Lib Dem voters. The majority of them voted Leave at the EU election. They want to reduce immigration. About half of them want to bring back the death penalty. And the reason that they switched from the Conservatives to the Lib Dems, James's research suggests, is due to what we call in political science valence rather than positional issues. Positional issue is whether someone's for or against the death penalty, for example, whereas a valence issue is a question about how well someone performs in doing the job. That might be competence or honesty or a sense that they represent people like you. And James shows that these voters switched, not because they stopped agreeing with the Tories on various issues, they just thought the Tories were rubbish. They saw the Conservatives as incompetent. That seems to be the main reason they defected from the Conservatives to the Lib Dems. So what's the lesson for the Conservatives and the Lib Dems moving forward here? Well, in some respects, there's some good news for the Conservatives. The voters that they lost to the Lib Dems still actually agree more with the Conservatives on many policy issues than they do with the Liberal Democrats. But the bad news is that competence is very difficult to project in opposition, and it's very difficult to recover from a sense of lost competence while in opposition. We can see this throughout recent British political history. The spectre of the winter of discontent hung around Labour like a millstone for a generation. The sense of incompetence and sleaze and economic unravelling of the major years probably not only helped Labour to win the 1997 election in a landslide, but also, I think, the 2001 election as well. The line that Labour crashed the economy in 2007, 2008, 2009 was something that Ed Miliband couldn't dislodge 6-7 years later at the time of the 2015 election. And all this makes me think that the next Conservative Prime Minister may not be someone who actually served in the last Conservative government. Because I think it's very difficult for Kemi Badenoch or any ex-Tory minister to dislodge associations with a government that the electorate has concluded was just not up to the job. And actually, if you look at the very last Prime Minister we had, who had served in a government as a minister that lost an election and then went on to be a Prime Minister, was Margaret Thatcher. And Thatcher, I think, was able to disassociate herself from that failed Conservative government of Edward Heath in 1970 to 1974, partly because she challenged Heath for the leadership, and Heath himself came to disavow her so strongly. So some really interesting research from that PhD researcher, James Breckwalt at Manchester University. So well done, James, and I encourage everyone to take a look at that. Lee, what is your matter of interest this week?
This week, I've been thinking about Vanity Fair, not the novel or the ongoing American magazine, but the much older British periodical, the one that's mostly remembered for its caricatures. Now, so in fact, we were in Whitney just the other day getting some framed. They were caricatures of Salisbury, F.E. Smith, Joseph Chamberlain, and Disraeli. And these have become quite iconic portrayals of politicians and judges and sportsmen and so on from the late part of the Victorian period and into the Edwardian era. So I was doing a bit of digging into where these actually came from. And it was a magazine called Vanity Fair, of course, that was published from 1868 to 1914 here in the UK as a weekly magazine. And it was intended to somewhat mimic the style of the Thackeray novel. It was meant to really be a satire of the indulgences of Victorian society. Over the years, people like Lewis Carroll and P.G. Wodehouse wrote for it, although its founding editor, a man called Thomas Bowles, was by far its most consequential writer. I have no idea what the content was like, to be honest. I find it very hard to find full editions of it still available. But what have survived, of course, are these very famous lithographs and caricatures. And they really produce a stunning cultural legacy. Of the ones that we recently got framed, two of them are my favourites I've ever seen, actually. One is of a elderly, elephantine-looking Salisbury, and then one of a much younger F.E. Smith, who would be the Earl of Birkenhead, sort of legs outstretched, cigarette in hand, titled "Moab is my washpot." They're really very striking depictions of these figures. And I wonder, maybe this is something that our magazine could bring back. We have an enormous number of political cartoonists today, some of whom are incredibly distinguished and produce some really good and funny and witty cartoons. And I half thought as I was reading about this the other day, wouldn't it be nice if when you buy a magazine at the moment, it came not just with a cartoon on the cover, so like the Spectator always does, but with a lithograph you can keep as well.
Yes, it would be lovely. And one of the sadnesses, I suppose, for me of the Vanity Fair prints is that the publication kind of wound up just at the time that the Labour Party was entering its position as one of the top two parties of British politics. So there aren't, as far as I know, that many Labour politicians who were actually covered in the piece, which is a bit of a shame because I would have loved to have seen some of the members of the Attlee cabinet, or indeed the Wilson cabinet, which I think has such a colourful cast of characters in it, portrayed in such a way.
Absolutely. The only one I know of a Labour figure is that iconic founder of the Labour Party, Keir Hardie, which is titled Queer Hardie, and is him looking rather ramshackled.
Well, thank you very much for that, Lee. And now we turn to our subject this week, where we look at confidence votes. And Lee, we've chosen this topic this week because you have just finished writing a book about Conservative leadership elections. And today's discussion comes from the chapter in your book on votes of no confidence. Now, at the moment, the book is just in manuscript form, so it's not out yet, available for the public, but I have been privileged to get a sneak preview of this chapter. So to set the scene, I wondered if you could first explain to us, what does it actually mean to say that a political party has confidence in their leader?
Really, it goes to the heart of leadership, that leaders have to be able to lead their parties. And that means that whoever is at the top needs to be somebody that everybody else wants to follow. So in a broad sense, members of a party have to have confidence that the person who is tasked with leading that party forward is the right person to do so. In some ways, it's an idea borrowed from Parliament and the House of Commons, where, of course, there are much more consequential confidence votes, sometimes in a government, and where the entire House decides whether or not that government commands majority support. But it also applies to parties as well, and there have been various different ways in which parties have tried to figure out, or leaders have tried to determine, whether or not they still command the support and the confidence of enough people within the party. Sometimes that has been the case, that there have been votes on other matters that have been treated as proxies for confidence in the leader. Sometimes it has been actual confidence votes in the House of Commons, where the government and the leader, in fact, might resign if they lose it. Or sometimes it's just been a general feeling and perception, often communicated in the Conservative Party by the chairman of the 1922 committee or by the chief whip, about how members of Parliament and backbenchers feel about the way in which a leader is conducting themselves. So in general terms, the idea of confidence is quite a loose sort of concept. It's not particularly defined what it must look like, tests of confidence, but it basically means, do the people who make up the party want the person who leads the party to be in their role?
And we discussed in a previous episode that it was only in 1965 that the Conservative Party actually started electing its leaders through a ballot of MPs. And the first winner of this system is Edward Heath. But as we discussed in an earlier episode about the election of Margaret Thatcher, there was initially no mechanism for getting rid of the Conservative leader. He had, as you've described, the freehold of the party leadership. In other words, the leader could stay there as long as the leader wished to stay as leader. But after the October 1974 defeat, Ted Heath's second defeat in just a year, Heath was effectively forced by Conservative MPs to allow for a change of the rules that would allow MPs to challenge the leader. So there isn't a vote of no confidence. It just moves to a system where an MP can directly challenge the leader. So is this ability of an MP to challenge the leader the first step towards the vote of no confidence? Was it considered a vote of no confidence, or was it not seen in those terms?
It's absolutely an important staging post between having proxies for confidence votes prior to 1974, having formal confidence votes in the leader after 1998. This is really an essential staging post between the two, because what you basically get, rather like you suggest, is leadership elections in which a vote for the challenger is a de facto vote of no confidence in the sitting leader. So this happens 4 times within those years. The first one, which we've discussed before, is Margaret Thatcher bringing down Edward Heath. And throughout that, Airy Neave, her campaign manager, was incredibly explicit that if you wanted rid of Heath, you had to vote for Thatcher. It's very much framed in those terms. Very similar happens in 1989 when Sir Anthony Mayer challenges Margaret Thatcher to try and bring her down. Nobody really thinks Mayer is an alternative leader or alternative prime minister. The idea is actually preposterous. It's why he's known as a stalking horse, somebody who is a challenger, but ultimately for an alternative leader to take the helm. When you have a stalking horse in particular, the dynamic is really quite obvious, that you're not voting for that person because you want them. You're voting for that person because they're a means of bringing down somebody else. It's an effective no confidence vote. Michael Heseltine did similar in 1990, although, of course, he did ultimately want to lead the party and become Prime Minister. And so did John Redwood. In fact, in 1995, he launched a leadership bid against John Major, in which he said that if the party didn't change, he had no chance, and he wanted to be that change. So yes, the leadership elections do become alternative ways of expressing confidence or not within a leader, but somewhat imperfect ones, because you have to vote for a person rather than just against the sitting leader.
Yes, it's an interesting setup. I mean, speaking from the Labour perspective, the Labour Party doesn't have a formal vote of no confidence as part of its leadership selection process. If you want to get rid of a leader, someone has to stand against the leader to get rid of them. What do you think are the advantages of or disadvantages of requiring someone to stand against the leader as the first step to removing them rather than having this kind of intermediary vote of no confidence?
There are definitely advantages and disadvantages. I mean, one of the advantages, I think, for sure, is that it makes removing a leader and choosing the successor basically part of the same process. So you're at least alive in some senses to the fact that, right, if you're ditching Margaret Thatcher, you've got to think about the alternatives in the here and now. That's, of course, different to what follows, where we now have confidence votes, as we'll come on to, in which it's not a case of, do you want to ditch this person in favour of somebody else? It's really just a question of, do you want to get rid of Boris Johnson? Do you want to get rid of Theresa May? And in many ways, having those as two separate processes is quite harmful. I mean, if we think of the last time a confidence vote was used in 2022, obviously about 40% of Tory MPs voted to bring down Boris Johnson. Would that number have been quite so high if they knew that Liz Truss was going to follow? The fact that the defenestration of Johnson and the election of Truss were wholly separate events, I think, was a contributing factor to that. So a definite advantage of the way in which things worked previously was that, like I say, you would ditch the leader and pick their replacement as generally part of the same process, albeit with multiple rounds. If there is a disadvantage, it's that you sometimes find yourself having to vote for somebody you don't really want in order to bring down somebody that you want even less. So there's a lot of gaming that had to go into the old way of doing things, which isn't ideal. In some ways, you would rather have a straightforward vote on one particular leader. But so, like I say, there are advantages and disadvantages. There's no perfect way of doing any of these things. One of the points I try to make in this book is the choosing and the removing of leaders is unavoidably complex, and there's no perfect way of doing it.
Okay, so you have a system where until 1975, there is no formal mechanism for removing leaders. Then you have a couple of decades where if Conservative MPs want to get rid of the leader, someone has to someone has to stand against the leader. And you cite 4 times that happens in 75, 89, 90, and 95. So what are the circumstances that lead us to where we are today, where now, if you want to remove a Conservative leader, you can't just announce your candidacy. There has to be a vote of no confidence in the leader?
Very good question. So 1998 is really the key turning point for all of this. So it is decided that for the election of a Conservative leader, it will no longer be a case of the parliamentary party choosing who should lead them. It will be a hybrid system in which members of parliament whittle down a shortlist to 2, and then members of the party across the country then get to vote on who they want to take over. And what that meant is that leadership elections went from being a relatively brief process that took place in the Palace of Westminster to a process that took many, many weeks, partly in Westminster, partly spread all over the country. And one thing that guaranteed is that you couldn't have these leadership elections regularly, and you could no longer use leadership elections as a way of testing the confidence in the leader. It just wouldn't have been practical. So they had to then try and think of an alternative. And the alternative they settled on was one which really kept the power to remove a leader with members of parliament in the House of Commons. So you get this discord, really, where the selection of a leader is a hybrid process in which members of the party in the country make the final decision. But whether or not that leader should stay in post is entirely a question for members of parliament. So they choose a method of doing that, which is to have a confidence vote. The way in which a confidence vote would work is that if 15% of Conservative MPs vote to the chairman of the 1922 committee, then a vote would be triggered. That vote would then be held as soon as practical. And then if the leader won a simple majority, they would carry on as leader. They would gain an immunity for the next 12 months, at least in theory. And if they lost it, they would not be able to stand in the election for their successor.
Right. And that 15%, figure now has become really important, and everyone is obsessed with have 15% of MPs put their letters in against the leader, which would precipitate a leadership election. 15% sounds rather arbitrary to me. Why settle on 15%?
It was the outcome of a very difficult and tense time for the Conservative Parliamentary Party, in which lots of people had different views about what the threshold should be. So William Hague, by then the Conservative leader, wanted it to be a relatively high threshold. Of course, there's very good reasons why a sitting leader would. So he proposed 25%. Conservative members of Parliament voted, and there was a whole range of thresholds that people thought there should be. Some people thought it should be as high as 30%. There were some eccentrics who thought there should be no threshold at all. There were, I think, 4 people voted for no threshold at all, and it's not really recorded how they imagined that could possibly work. But a plurality voted for 10%. So you get the leadership wanting 25%, a plurality of MPs voting for a 10% threshold. The average of where MPs voted was something like 17, 18%. And so the figure of 15% was really settled on in the end as a compromise.
And under the previous system, if you wanted to stand against the leader, did you just need a proposer and seconder?
Depends on when it happened, really. So prior to 1990, yes, that was the case. So all you needed to have a leadership election before the fall of Margaret Thatcher was for there to be an alternative candidate nominated at the time in which the annual question of the leadership was put after the Queen's speech. But they decided that that was actually a remarkably low threshold because it only required a proposer and seconder, sort of absurdly low, really. And so after 1990, it was decided that 10% of MPs would have to write to the chairman of the 1922 committee saying they wanted to have a contest in order for a leadership ballot to then potentially be held. So it was slightly higher, in fact, than it had been under the old rules.
Okay, so under the old rules, it's a 10% threshold, and then it moves up to 15% for this vote of no confidence. Who was the first Conservative leader who was subjected to a formal vote of no confidence under these new rules? And can you tell us a little bit about the circumstances of that challenge?
So that takes us forward to 2003 and Iain Duncan Smith's leadership of the party. So Duncan Smith's period was quite a miserable one for the Tory party, really, in which the leadership rules that they chose to adopt in 1988 were really shown to be flawed. So Duncan Smith never really had much support within the parliamentary party. He got less than a third of the votes of MPs, even on the final MPs ballot, before being selected by the party members to be leader. So he always started with quite a weak mandate, in fact. But to be fair, Conservative MPs gave him the benefit of the doubt in the first couple of years of his leadership. But it never really looked like he was changing the dial. It never really looked as if he was at risk of defeating Tony Blair at the next general election. And in fact, in some ways, the Conservative Party was falling further behind during his leadership, particularly to the Liberal Democrats, who were doing very well in some parliamentary by-elections, particularly around the time of the Iraq War, which of course was incredibly controversial. By 2003, many Conservative MPs started to think that they were simply treading water or, in fact, starting to drown with Duncan Smith at the helm. And this really comes to a head at the 2003 Conservative Party conference. So Duncan Smith is under pressure. The headlines have been bad. There's a feeling that MPs are going to move against him at some stage. We should say, as a tangent, that as the conference starts, not a single letter demanding a confidence vote has been put in against Duncan Smith. But there's a lot of pressure on Duncan Smith, regardless, to try and have a good conference and to try and reassert his authority as leader. One of the things that happens to try and bring this about is as he gives this rather lackluster speech, in which he says, famously, "The quiet man is here to stay and he's turning up the volume," he receives 18 standing ovations. Now, that is pretty unheard of, really, I think, at a party conference. You probably get a standing ovation when you come in, probably when you leave, maybe a couple of times at best in the middle. But it's not particularly likely that you're going to get, certainly for a poor speech, the members jumping to their feet every couple of minutes. It was basically a ruse by Conservative staff to try and show that there was a lot of affection among the grassroots for Duncan Smith. This actually annoyed quite a lot of people who were in the room, including Conservative MPs, who didn't want to appear disloyal, but also resented being dragged to their feet every time Duncan Smith said something moderately competent. And then over the course of October, you begin to see the letters against Iain Duncan Smith increase. One thing that's really notable about this is it's the first time it's happened. Now, Duncan Smith's leadership is the first time the members have chosen a leader, and it's also the first time that MPs have really been dissatisfied with their choice of leader, and there's been pressure to send in the letters to get a confidence vote. And so a lot of people don't really know how to approach it. And some of the stories of how MPs did go about submitting their letters are absurd. So there's one MP mentioned in Michael Spicer's diaries. Michael Spicer was chairman of the 1922 committee at the time, who asked to meet one of Spicer's staff at one of the gates of Westminster Tube Station, and then hands her the letter stuffed inside of a magazine. I mean, it's like something out of a John le Carré novel. It's really quite absurd. But eventually these letters do climb. The 15% threshold is eventually reached, and MPs do have a ballot on Iain Duncan Smith's leadership. That happens just about a month after the conference has been in Blackpool, and he loses it. Not by a landslide, but decisively. So 90 people vote against him, and 75 choose to keep him in office.
But one of the things that surprised me reading your chapter was how slow at this time Conservative MPs were to put in their letters against him, especially compared to more recent history. Why the hesitancy?
MPs didn't really know how the system worked, I think it's fair to say, and they were very uncertain about how to approach it. A couple of things that stand out. One is that 15% is less than 1 in 6 MPs. So there's not necessarily a sense that if you want rid of this man, you've got to be the one to act, because it's quite a small threshold to meet, really. But so I think a lot of MPs thought if there was discontent, that other people would be the voice of that. Part of the nervousness, I think, as well, is that many of the things that we now assume about letters going into the chairman of the 1922 committee asking for a confidence vote is that they're secret. Graham Brady in particular became infamous for how tight-lipped he was as chairman of the 22. But that wasn't necessarily known at the time. People didn't know whether or not Michael Spicer was keeping these letters in a safe or, stuffing them into his pocket so they might fall out in St. James's Park. It wasn't totally clear at the time that this would be a really discreet process. So in many ways, Tory MPs are sort of fumbling around in the dark about how this process will work. And also, I think in some cases, wondering whether or not this is actually really necessary. Throughout that month of October, there was a huge number of negative headlines about Duncan Smith, about his diminishing authority as leader. And I think there are some Tory MPs who think, well, he's going to go. I almost don't need to put a letter in because it's so obvious that he's a failing leader. He is just going to resign and fall on his sword. So I think quite a few people wondered if the mechanism even needed to be used.
It still does astonish me, though. I mean, you write in the chapter that 10 members of the 1922 committee voted for Iain Duncan Smith to resign or to call a vote of no confidence. And yet at that time, only 3 Conservative MPs had actually sent in their letters that would have brought about a vote of no confidence. So not even all of the 10 MPs voting for a vote of no confidence as a motion of the 1922 committee that had no constitutional significance. They hadn't even deployed the basic power that they had as an MP to bring that event about. And it just makes me wonder, did Conservative MPs just not understand the rules? It seems such a huge dereliction of duty.
I think 2 points on that. One of them is to say that a challenge of the confidence vote process is that you have a lot of people with titles or roles that might make them think they're not suitable people to put letters in. Of course, you have the front bench, you have the shadow cabinet, people who are meant to be loyal to the leader and may therefore feel that they can't write in, particularly if they think there's a chance that will become known more widely. That also applies, I think, to some degree, certainly at the time, to the executive committee of the 1922. But like you say, it is striking. The second thing I would say is that some people certainly did not really understand the rules at the time and how it worked. So an example of this is David Davis is on Question Time. David Davis had stood for the leadership in 2001. He would stand for it again in 2005, a very ambitious Conservative MP. And he's on Question Time and he says, I will not stand against Iain Duncan Smith. Now, what's striking about that statement is that there are no circumstances in which he could. Because of the way in which the leadership rules have changed, Duncan Smith will either be brought down with a confidence vote or not, and if he is brought down, then he's not eligible to stand in the race to be his successor. So David Davis couldn't possibly stand against him. But you get this lingering sense, I think, of the pre-1998 rules, particularly from the totally memorable downfall of Margaret Thatcher, that some people don't even seem to have appreciated that things have changed, sort of in the way that they have. So yes, certainly these rules aren't bedded in yet. Even if they are understood in theory, they're not really understood in practice.
And I think sometimes the blame also needs to go to political journalists who often talk in ways still today as if certain rules are still in effect when they are not.
You're entirely right. There was a piece in 2023, 2024, I think, that named Penny Mordaunt as a possible stalking horse against Rishi Sunak. Well, I mean, this is many, many decades now since you could even have a stalking horse, but still that term was being bandied around in the newspapers.
Yes, the only way I could see under the new rules that the incumbent leader could actually stand in a contest before the members would be if the incumbent leader resigned the leadership, created a vacancy in the leadership, and then stood as a candidate for the vacant leadership. Is that possible?
My understanding is that it's not possible because quite often the way in which a leader has been forced out hasn't been through a confidence vote, but has been through what we might call non-procedural methods of trying to force them out by using a battering ram to get them out of number 10 Downing Street, in effect. So as we'll come on to, both Theresa May and Boris Johnson do both resign. And technically they resign of their own free will rather than being forced out by a confidence vote. But it was not the view of anybody at the time, certainly when Johnson resigned, and there was maybe the thought that he might have wanted to do this because he was so keen to cling on to power, that he could have been a candidate in that election.
So after Iain Duncan Smith, there are two more Conservative leaders who face votes of no confidence against them under these rules. Can you briefly tell us who they were and how these votes came about and what their consequences were?
So people who have lived through the past decade of British political history will know much of this story already. The first time a confidence vote is used after Duncan Smith is against Theresa May in December 2018. Now, this is in some ways fundamentally different to 2003, because May isn't just party leader, she's also Prime Minister at the time. So the stakes are altogether higher, both for May and the leadership, but also for MPs attempting to bring her down. The reason for the confidence vote is that it became very clear that Theresa May was following a trajectory on leaving the European Union, on delivering Brexit, which a big chunk of the Eurosceptic parts of the Conservative Party did not agree with. It's very much the Brexiteers who try to move against her. She suffered resignations from the cabinet over Chequers. She's had people like Jacob Rees-Mogg in November of that year tell members of the European Research Group, the ERG, to try and put in confidence votes and to try and bring her down. They eventually succeed. A little later than they expect, actually. It takes quite a long time for the 15% threshold to be met. They eventually succeed in early December 2018. May, in fact, wins that vote fairly comfortably. She wins it with over 60% of the vote. It's the best performance of any Conservative leader in a confidence vote. And she then tries to plough on and deliver her Brexit agenda and the eventual deal with the 3 meaningful votes, which she goes on to lose. The next time it's used is then in June 2022, and that's against Boris Johnson. Johnson's premiership, of course, is one of soaring highs and pitiful lows for the Conservative Party. And the lows really begin to compound and the letters really start to come in with the Owen Paterson scandal towards the end of 2021, when there's an attempt to change the way in which the standards process works. And that would have benefited Paterson, a Conservative MP. The letters then begin to trickle up, but it's really Partygate, which really sees the number of letters start to climb. And you get to the point where in February 2022, there were about 48 letters in. It would have taken 54 to trigger the vote. Then the Ukraine war happens. The Russian invasion of Ukraine happens. Arguably one of Johnson's sort of finest moments on the world stage, where he's resolute behind Ukraine and Vladimir Zelensky as its leader. And at that stage, quite a few Conservative MPs start to think, well, this is not the time. There is a war on the European continent. We cannot be putting the internal Tory party matter in effect of who is our leader ahead of Britain's position in the world as Ukraine tries to fight for its own sovereignty. So the number of letters then drops, actually, and drops quite markedly. But by May in particular, the Partygate scandal is roaring on. The urgency of the Ukraine conflict is beginning to fade somewhat from people's minds. And it's on the weekend of the Platinum Jubilee for the late Queen Elizabeth II that the threshold is crossed and a confidence vote is declared as happening. It happens on the Monday after the Platinum Jubilee celebrations conclude. And again, Johnson wins that vote rather less convincingly than May does, but he does win that vote and therefore commits some plans to carrying on.
Now, with Theresa May, she was operating under that piece of constitutional savagery known as the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which meant that MPs could vote against their own government's legislation, but the Prime Minister could not designate that legislation as a matter of confidence, meaning that, contrary to all experience of British parliamentary democracy, you might have a government that could survive without actually being able to pass its key pieces of legislation. So do you think the fact that Theresa May couldn't make her Brexit deal in particular a true matter of confidence weakened her position as Conservative leader, or do you think that strengthened her in some way?
It's a very good question. It's quite a difficult one to answer. A couple of observations I would make is the fact that the Conservative Party confidence vote happened before any of the meaningful votes on Theresa May's Brexit deal. That enables her to stay in office for longer than she otherwise would have done. The first meaningful vote, the government lost by 230 in a staggering rebuttal of May's entire Brexit strategy in the House of Commons. I think if that had been clear at the time at which the internal party confidence vote had taken place, then I think she would have done much worse and potentially have lost it, because it was clear the government could not pass its legislation. She was also arguably strengthened by the fact that these meaningful votes were not de facto confidence votes. It's hard to imagine any of May's predecessors, really, losing a vote on a flagship piece of legislation by such an enormous margin and not resigning. But she was in this uniquely weak position in one sense, in that she wasn't popular enough with her party or the country to have a general election and take the issue to the country. But then she was in a uniquely strong place in a different sense, because she had the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which meant that this was not a confidence vote. And she also had the fact that she was in this immunity period that the confidence votes within the party offered to a leader. So it's a really constitutionally muddled period, I think, throughout 2019, or the early months of 2019, for Theresa May.
Now, to win a vote of no confidence, you simply need to win 50% plus one of the votes cast. And you write in your chapter that this seems somewhat unsatisfactory, because you can have leaders like Theresa May and Boris Johnson who win their votes of confidence, but as many as 40% of their MPs vote no confidence in them. Possibly a majority of their backbenchers vote no confidence in them. But they survive and then are formally protected from any challenge for a year. You believe that it's important that a leader wins a vote of no confidence convincingly. And I wonder what you think that looks like.
It is worth enforcing that point, that the idea of the threshold for maintaining confidence in a leader is 50% plus one is an absurdity. It's really borrowed from the way in which confidence votes work for governments. But of course, if you are a government with a majority of one, as long as you can command that majority time and time again, you can pass any legislation you like through the House of Commons. It's really a different thing being a leader of a party who doesn't need unanimous support necessarily from their own benches, but certainly needs overwhelming and consistent support, I think, from their own MPs. It's remarkable that in 1998, there wasn't really much debate about what the threshold for winning should be and what that would look like. And so they came up with a set of rules in which 49% of your MPs could vote against you, but you would technically have won the confidence of the parliamentary party and be immune from further challenge for another year. I just do not think that is sensible. And in fact, we know from the last two occasions, the May example and the Johnson example, that it doesn't really work either. As what you then end up having is MPs swapping the procedural ways of bringing down a leader, i.e. a confidence vote, for non-procedural ways of doing it. So both May and Johnson end up going as leader and prime minister during this period of immunity. The immunity period is a nonsense, in effect. And in May's case, it happens because Parliament, with a lot of Conservative rebellions, consistently votes down her approach to Brexit. And she tries a meaningful votes 3 times, loses every time. And in Johnson's case, it's even more brutal, even bloodier in many ways, because it comes from mass resignations of his government, to the point that he can't plausibly form a quality cabinet or fill the ministerial ranks. So yes, my view is very much that to say it's 50% plus 1 and you've got the confidence of the parliamentary party does not really make any sense. And pretending that that is in fact the case only leads to these bloodier removals and defenestrations later on.
I find many aspects of the Conservative leadership rules unsatisfactory, some of the ones you've just described. Another is this whole idea that MPs can kind of keep sending in letters against their leader, and they can send them in and take them out. I think that leads to this kind of drip weakening of the political power of the leader. It leads to just constant speculation as to whether this 15% threshold has been reached. But I think something that is perhaps even more alarming about it is the lack of transparency around it and the amount of power that it vests in the chairman of the 1922 committee, who was the sole keeper of the letters, and as far as I understand, is the sole person who verifies and counts these letters and doesn't have to show anyone else in the party, not even one other person, these letters. You interviewed Graham Brady, who was chairman of the 1922 committee during the last Conservative government, and he told you that when Liz Truss was leader, he didn't even bother counting the number of letters that had been put in against Truss. He just thought it was so obvious from the volume that was coming in that the threshold had been reached, and then he put this to her and she decided to resign rather than face an actual vote of no confidence. But I find the fact that he is open about not even counting the number of letters absolutely staggering. I mean, I just can't really compute this slapdash approach. And it just also opens up the possibility that a chairman of the 1922 committee could feasibly claim that the 15% threshold has been reached, even though it wasn't. And there's no way of verifying that. So am I misplaced in my dissatisfaction with this arrangement, or is it full of loopholes and kind of security flaws?
It's certainly the case that it puts a lot of trust in the chairman of the 1922 committee. They are really the crux of the entire process and model. If they act in bad faith at any time, the entire system can fall apart. So, for example, if they threw away some letters or didn't count them, if they decided to exaggerate the number of letters themselves, there's no verification. So yes, it definitely puts a lot of trust in that person. That person, it is worth saying, has been chosen by Conservative MPs and is really the shop steward of the backbenchers. And they're always able to be removed if they become unsatisfied with them. If I make a defence of Graham Brady in particular about the Liz Truss point, so my understanding is that he never counted the letters he received against Liz Truss, but a couple of things are worth noting about that. One is that as a new leader, Liz Truss also benefited from this immunity period of a year. So the letters didn't really take effect at that time. Secondly, my understanding is there were so many people saying to Brady, she has got to go. Sometimes just in person, sometimes they may have written it down, that there was a real feeling of just chaos within the parliamentary party, that he could read as an experienced parliamentarian or just as somebody with eyes and ears really at that time, without necessarily having to refer to the number of letters that were in. If it had been the case that Truss refused to go when she did, and certainly Liz Truss's removal could have been much more difficult given the rules of the party. If she had said, for example, well, I'm not going, and if you want a confidence vote in me, you've got to change your rules, then the 1922 committee could have had an internal vote to change the rules and allow a confidence vote. And I've no doubt at that point you would have definitely counted them to verify it. I personally think Graham Brady was an exemplar in many respects as chairman of the 1922 committee, although I do know that some people rather resent the fact that he's written this autobiography, Kingmaker, in which he spilled the beans and been more indiscreet than he ever was before.
Okay, fair enough on the point about not counting the letters, because Liz Truss did have that 12-month reprieve as a new leader. I'll accept that as a reasonable justification. So when there have been votes of no confidence, they've happened really very quickly. So the threshold is met, and then in the case of Iain Duncan Smith and Theresa May, the vote was within 24 hours. With Boris Johnson, there was a slight reprieve because of the fact that it happened during the Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee, as you've discussed. Why the haste? Why doesn't the leader maybe give themselves a week to try and rally the troops behind them?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the rules say it should be as soon as practical, but the ultimate timing is a question for the chairman of the 1922 committee and the leader to decide between them. Everybody has opted for a very quick confidence vote. I think that's partly to try and shorten the bad news cycle. You don't want the question of, is the leader going to remain in post, dominating the headlines day after day after day until the vote eventually happens? I think the other reason for it is that leaders often think that a quick and snappy vote will benefit them. That if you're a sitting leader, you get the chance to address all Conservative MPs before they vote. And that is really your chance to make a big, decisive pitch to win support. The longer you leave it, the more likely it is that the plotters against you will be able to take the initiative and get on the front foot. So I think there are advantages to incumbent leaders in going ASAP.
There's a fundamental difference between the way that the Conservatives and Labour choose their leaders and the basis of confidence on which those leaders survive in office. As you've described, in the Conservative Party, the members really have no input into the question of the survival of the leader. In the Labour Party, the election of the leader is also a hybrid between the MPs' nominations and then the members voting on the nominees. But the survival of the leader is actually tied not to the MPs, but to the members. And so this was why, under Labour's rules, Jeremy Corbyn was able to survive as party leader, even though his MPs clearly had no confidence in him. In fact, they had a vote of confidence in him, which has no standing within the rules of the Labour Party. It's a kind of symbolic gesture. Corbyn lost that overwhelmingly and then survived a leadership challenge, which is the correct way to remove a Labour leader, with 61% of the vote. And so you have this scenario where the Labour leader can survive even though he doesn't have the confidence of his MPs, which is an impossibility in the Conservative system. So do you think that the Conservative arrangement is a better arrangement because it requires the leader to have the support of the parliamentary party?
It really comes down to the nature of what are political parties. And I think the Westminster style of democracy and the way in which our government works really requires that our parties are parliamentary parties first and foremost, certainly if they want to try and compete to be in government and if they wish to try and remain in government. The fact that a leader can maintain the support of their MPs and can therefore, certainly if they have a majority, deliver their governing agenda is essential. And if you were to try and say, as the Labour Party of course does, that the party isn't primarily a parliamentary party, it's a movement, it's something much wider. The Labour Party conference is sovereign over policy making, for example. Then I think that creates big issues. For Corbyn, I think those issues were dodged by the fact that Labour was in opposition at the time. But what if Corbyn was in government? If the vast majority of his MPs had voted against him in a confidence vote like that, but he could then be reimposed on the parliamentary party as leader by the grassroots, you would have had an almighty constitutional blow-up. This would have been a disaster, really, for the country, I think a disaster for the Labour Party, and would have left Labour MPs with no option, if they wished to remove Corbyn as their leader, than to actually bring down the government altogether. So I think the risk of a clash between the parliamentary party and the party in the country is really acute within the Labour Party and is best avoided. And that is at least one bit of wisdom within the Conservative Party rules.
I agree. I think that the Labour arrangement is very flawed. And quite personally, as I've written to now over a decade, I think that the Labour Party should just return to leaving MPs to be the selectors and electors of the leader. Now, one thing you write in your chapter is that under the 1998 rules, Conservative leaders have the power to force a vote of no confidence in themselves before the 15% threshold is met. So in other words, they don't have to wait to this kind of moment of truth. And then if they win that vote of no confidence, then the advantage is that they could be safe for a year. You write that the leaders don't make use of this power. Why don't they? And do you think they should?
It's a good question. The idea that you could trigger a confidence vote yourself went into the 1998 rules, in part inspired by the example of John Major. So in 1995, he didn't wait for the leadership challenge to be launched against him. He resigned the leadership and called it himself. And in many ways, that secured, I think, John Major's time as leader for the rest of that parliament. No leader since has tried to call the vote themselves. I wonder in part if that's because this provision of the rules is forgotten about, that it's not really thought that you can have a vote or that you bring about yourself. I think it's also in part because, of course, it's risky. We almost assume that leaders have almost unanimous support, if not unanimous support, from their parties in Parliament, because that is the way the whipping system works, how they're often made to vote. And so to expose the fact in a publicly declared vote that there is any discontent comes with great risks. What I would say, though, is that in the case of Duncan Smith, May and Johnson, each of them could have triggered the vote if they wished at a better time for them. They waited until the pressure was really strong and the vote was imposed on them. If Johnson, for example, had decided to call a confidence vote in the early weeks of the Ukraine crisis, it might have been exploiting an international emergency, but I certainly think he would have won the overwhelming backing of the Conservative Parliamentary Party at that time. So if you used it well as a leader, I think a confidence vote could be something that makes sense in certain circumstances to trigger, rather than just waiting for the attacks against you to build.
So we talked about a lot of the aspects that are unsatisfactory about the Conservative leadership election rules and also some of Labour's. How should the Conservative Party, in your view, address some of the problems we've discussed today? Should it return to the old stalking horse approach, or are there some other reforms that you would advocate?
Some of the issues have in fact been addressed already. So I wrote a piece for The Spectator a little while back about how 15% is not a great threshold for a confidence vote. Part of my thinking is that in the May and the Johnson cases, 15% triggered a vote at a point at which the parliamentary was not yet ready to remove the leader, but was ready to mortally wound them, and that created and stored up new problems. So I think there's an argument that 15% is too low a threshold, and the 1922 committee now agrees. On the day that Kemi Badenoch was made Conservative leader, Bob Blackman, the new chairman of the 1922, announced that the threshold was now a third of all MPs, 33%, more than double what it was before. So I think that means that what we will now see is that confidence votes won't occur until there is much more pressure. I think when a confidence vote happens, it will almost certainly be lost, because more than twice as many MPs have written in to try and force it. In fact, it probably makes sense if you're a Tory leader suffering a confidence vote just to resign there and then. I don't think the position would be sustainable at the moment at which a vote is declared and about to be had. So that idea of the threshold has already been addressed. The idea of the immunity period hasn't, and that still poses, I think, very significant sort of challenges for the party. Nor has the idea that we touched upon a little earlier, that the removal of a leader and the selection of their replacement are fundamentally separate processes rather than part of the same sort of mechanism. And that is also incredibly difficult to see how that can be addressed. But certainly, I think by raising the threshold, they've made a step in the right direction.
Well, we finish our podcast with a discussion about the books that we're reading at the moment. So, Lee, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I've just picked up a book at the moment that's more than a decade old, actually, called Revolt on the Right by Matt Goodwin and Rob Ford. And it's really the story of UKIP and how UKIP, up until about 2013, became a huge force in British politics. I'm reading this, of course, because Nigel Farage, UKIP's most famous leader, is back, and back in a big way. And what got me thinking about it and what made me read it is that we often think about reform now as being a unique challenge compared to Farage's previous political incarnations. But in some ways, they're not all that different. So in 2015, for example, UKIP got 12.6% of the vote. in 2024, Reform got, I think it was 14.3% of the vote. They're not really all that different. Farage has achieved a level of electoral support nearly as high as they got last July in the past, although, of course, without winning any seats in Parliament in the process, which makes this fundamentally different. But we have seen Farage as a big player for quite some time. And one of the things I'm interested in this book is why is it that UKIP eventually ceased to be a major force in British politics? And is there a chance that might happen again with Reform? One of the things that this book chronicles in a very dramatic and interesting way is the infighting that has always happened within Farage's parties. UKIP was rife with infighting constantly, whether they're famous and absurd cases with Robert Kilroy-Silk, or just with internal disagreements about whether or not the party should be a full-blooded political party, or whether it should just try and be a pressure group on the Conservative Party. The ultimate reason, of course, of why UKIP eventually declines into irrelevance, and that's not covered, in fact, by this book, but follows afterwards, is that it is effectively a single-issue party, and its big driving mission has been met. Reform is a different beast to that, and that is, I think, where the differences begin to come in. It's not quite a single-issue party, although it's very closely tied to the question of immigration, of course, and how will its agenda sort of be met in a way that could lead to its decline is a very open question. So this is a book I'm enjoying reading. It gives a great background, I think, really on Farage and Farage's first ascent into political relevance. And it's one I would really think people should read, with the caveat that the next chapter in Farage's political career is probably going to be more interesting than those that have come before. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, earlier this week, you and I went to Arundel's, which was the home of Edward Heath, which has now been turned into a museum in his honor. And Arundel's also hosts speakers. And the speaker this week was Catherine Carter, who is the curator of Chartwell, Winston Churchill's country home in Kent. It was a wonderful speech. She was asked questions by our Queen Mary colleague, Tom Chidwick. And Catherine has written a book called Churchill's Citadel, Chartwell, and the Gatherings Before the Storm, which we purchased at Arundel's. And I've been dipping into this book, and it's a charming and fascinating and deeply researched piece, which tells how Winston Churchill made use of Chartwell as his country home to build relationships with anti-fascists in the 1930s, in the years before the start of the Second World War, where he gathered intelligence from figures who were German and Austrian and American and Chinese, from all around the world. And that helped to shape and inform his confidence that Britain needed to confront Nazism, that appeasement would not work. And really having that space outside of Westminster enabled him to have these long and well-developed conversations, which I think fits so nicely with the podcast that we did earlier this year on Grace and Favour homes and the importance of those retreats for British politicians. So I really recommend this book to our listeners.
Absolutely, a book that's well worth reading. We'll have the links to the books that we've discussed in our show notes, but that's all from us this week. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a period of British political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.